or my screen. So today we're going to be talking about the Second Sino-Japanese War. So the Second Sino-Japanese War, the First Sino-Japanese War happened before this one, but the Sino-Japanese War, does anybody have any idea of what Sino means? Like when someone refers to something as Sino, what does Sino mean? Anyone have any ideas? You can raise your hand if you. China. Yeah, thank you, Langston. So China, right? So when someone refers to something as Sino, it's with regards to China. So the Sino-Japanese War is a war between China and Japan. So between China and Japan. And this war technically started in 1937, but it had its roots as early as 1931. Okay, so we're going to be talking a little bit about how this came to be. And I actually put this presentation together in preparation for a Thanksgiving camp that we had earlier last month during Thanksgiving. So some of the content is kind of like geared towards that camp, but the structure is going to be pretty similar to what we would be generally doing in a regular history class with Able to Shine with me as your instructor. Just so you guys know, usually I will assign homework, I will assign reading. There are midterms and finals for this class, so it's important that we are paying attention and we are doing the assignments. The midterms and the finals are 30-minute quizzes that I'll be administering for everyone to actually know, do. And that just kind of make sure that we're kind of keeping track of these key events and things that we need to know. So just so everyone's on the same boat here, or on the same page. Now, let's see. So, okay, yeah. So I will also be assigning reading. So after every class, there's going to be some reading. It might be excerpts from a book. It could be an article that I'm going to link to everyone. There is going to be reading involved, and we are going to have to touch back on in the next following classes, and we'll be sharing what we read about. I'm going to have people take turns presenting in 2 to 3 minute presentations about what they learned and what they read about and what they liked about each lesson. So there is going to be a little bit of public speaking. For those of you guys who have taken other Able to Shine classes, that's a very major focus of the program. So that extends out to here in history as well. All right. Now, this course, this series is titled Critically Thinking Through History. So we're going to be using history to actually do some I'm going to be using history basically as a tool to help you guys do critical thinking, to get the gears working in your heads, to start thinking about different things in history, making these connections, seeing history in a way that you will be it'll feel like you're solving problems in such a way that you would be in mathematics or science. So it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it, but I can't wait for all of you guys to get to experience this. So first and foremost, let's start with a discussion question. What are some of the most important factors to winning a war? If you're fighting in a war, what's important? All right. I'm going to let you guys think about this for a second. I'm going to start calling on you guys. I'm seeing you in the chat. Tina says troops. Yeah, you guys can go ahead and say it in the chat too. If you guys just go ahead and type it out if you want to share something. So Tina says troops are important. Thank you, Tina. Tanks. Tanks are also important. Strategy. Very good, Sophie. Strategy. Air Force. Having a good Air Force. I like all these answers. These are all really smart. Archers. Yeah. Archers kind of goes along with troops, right? You want to have naval. Yeah. You want to get good ship powers. You have to have a good president. And very good, Ethan. That's a good leadership. Cavalry. Cavalry. Interesting. Cavalry. Horseback infantry. That's what cavalry
Weapons.
Weapons. Victor says weapons. Tina, Tina sounds like she's been reading The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Okay. Let's see. Spies. That's funny. Spies are always good. Having good intelligence gathering personnel on the ground to monitor your enemy. All right. Defense. You want to have good defense. Soldiers, good soldiers. Okay, so you guys are on the right path here. I'm gonna start steering you guys towards our actual discussion. I like this. I like this a lot. So Yeah, you want to have good armies, right? So this picture of little armies and legions of plastic soldiers, these represents good armies, big standing armies. You want to have a good military power, all right? What is this? It's a piggy bank. And the pig is standing on a bunch of coins.
Money. Money. Yay.
You have to have
lots of money to war.
Yeah.
So lots of money.
Think about a lot of the time is when you're fighting a war, having money is incredibly important because it's like you need to actually have like you need to be able to afford the war you're fighting. If you can't afford the war you're fighting, you're not going to be doing so hot. You know, a lot of the times people go to war over resources, you know, and people will, you know, a lot of governments will use wars to, you know, get themselves into a better position worldwide. But it's always important that you need to have money. You need to have a good economy. You got to have a good wartime economy, right? Money for shields, money for swords. Very good. Armor. Thank you, Evan and Vincent. Very good answers. Happy people. What do these happy people you think represent? I'm gonna throw you guys a bone here. So this here is supposed to represent public opinion. You want the people that you're ruling to be happy, but you also want, yeah, it's a good one. So if you want good relationships between soldiers, right? But also like you want the people that you're ruling over to be happy too. Because if you take over another country, if you take over a village or another territory, and the people that you're taking over don't like you very much, they're gonna want to find ways to backstab you. They want to find ways to, you know, turn things around over on your head, right? They might even start an insurgency, which is why it's important to always have public opinion on your side. If you're going to a war, it's important that your war is a popular war. You want people to, you want your people at home, but also, you know, you want to be a benevolent leader. What are you saying? Agree or disagree? Ethan, what are you saying? I'm calling on you, Ethan. You want to share? Yeah, Ethan, what are you saying? You can go ahead and unmute.
Chat.
What's up?
I was just typing in chat.
Okay, cool. So yeah, let's see what else. This guy here represents natural resources, right? You want to have natural resources. You want to have oil. You know, you got to have materials to actually create things like tanks, airplanes, boats. You know, all these things. Yeah, food. You have to actually have a supply of natural resources to win a war. Okay. So the war in question today is the Second Sino-Japanese War. So a lot of people think that, or like in America, we teach that World War II started in the year 1941 when Pearl Harbor was bombed, right? But that's true for America, but it's not true for everybody, okay? For China, for example, World War II started. China had already been kind of involved in some sort of war against Japan for about 10 years by the time Pearl Harbor was bombed. So Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and annexed it, created a puppet government called Manchukuo or Manchukuo, right? And they were poised to be in a war with China at that point. So, you know, when Japan and China were going to war, these things were all things they had to consider to see who was going to ultimately come out the winner. And Japan invaded China because China had a lot of this. I'm going to go ahead and China had a lot of this one right here. China had a lot of natural resources, all right, especially in Western and Southwestern China. There's a lot of natural resources out there. And that's what Japan was after, okay? So the situation in China in 1937. So here's a map of China in 1941, but it's still pretty similar to how it looked in 37. So Japan has already conducted a full-scale invasion of Manchuria. So Manchuria has become a Japanese puppet government, as you can see outlined in red. Japanese armies are now on mainland China. They're prepared to fight the Chinese, okay? And on top of that, there is kind of a civil war going on. The communist Chinese and the nationalist Chinese forces are kind of in an uneasy stalemate. So the nationalist Chinese forces are led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek, and the Communist Chinese forces are led by a guy named Mao Zedong. And Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong were fighting for a while, and then now they're kind of in the middle of a stalemate. So you have the nationalists and the Chinese forces kind of fighting each other, and they're now that the Japanese have entered the picture, they decided to basically go on like a little truce. That being said, the nationalist Chinese forces are more responsible for doing a lot of the fighting because that's supposedly the government, the main government of China at the time. So the Republic of China was the nationalist forces. The communist forces kind of were closer to northern China, northwestern China, so they're kind of like away from the bulk of the fighting, but they still helped a little bit. So we're going to compare China and Japan. All right, so in 1937, the Japanese military had 600,000 troops in China. The Chinese army, on the other hand, had 1,700,000 troops. All right, it's a lot of troops. That being said, Chinese troops were poorly equipped. They didn't have a lot of guns. Some of them didn't even have rifles. A lot of Chinese troops were fighting with swords, spears, melee weapons, for example. Whereas the Japanese troops were better trained. Japanese troops had more like better training, had more better equipment. The standard of the average Japanese soldier was a lot higher than the standard of the average Chinese soldier. So in like a 1 versus 1 battle between your average Chinese and your average Japanese soldier, the Japanese soldier, in spite of being outnumbered, was a better warrior. Okay, at least they were better equipped. The Chinese army also lacked heavy artillery. They didn't have a lot of armored vehicles either. So the Japanese had better artillery, which are like big cannons. The Japanese had better tanks, had armored cars, all these kinds of things that made ground combat more efficient for them. So the Chinese were kind of behind in this regard. The Chinese Air Force also was not very well trained, and the Chinese Air Force didn't have a lot of modern aircraft. So compared to the Japanese Air Force, both the Japanese Army and the Japanese Naval Air Forces, the Chinese Air Force wasn't as well equipped. Most of the planes were obsolete, some of them were even hand-me-downs from the old warlord era, and they were trying to buy everything that they could buy from the United Kingdom, the United States, everyone. So the Chinese were kind of behind when it came to having a modern Air Force. Oh, okay, I guess that's that. All right, so on July 7th, 1937, there was something called the Marco Polo Bridge incident. All right, so this was the Marco Polo Bridge, and this is technically the very start of the war. So there was confused gunfire, so there was a bit of shooting that happened between Chinese and Japanese troops that eventually snowballed into actual serious fighting. And this is what really began the Sino-Japanese War. So at first, it was just kind of confused, like someone probably accidentally shot, or maybe not accidentally, across the bridge, and then suddenly that kind of just snowballed into a full-scale shooting war. All right. So you can kind of see here in this picture, these are Chinese troops in the bottom. One of them even has a checkmate ZB-26 machine gun. That's what that is, right there in the middle. Okay, so this we're going to go into something called soapstone. So soapstone is a thing that I like to teach. It's something that they use in high school AP classes. So in high school AP US History or high school World History, you'll run into the soapstone, which is a method of analyzing documents, okay? And it's really fun. So the soapstone, in our case, I'm going to go ahead and move this over here. The soapstone is an acronym. The first S stands for speaker. So the speaker is who made this document, who wrote this document, okay? O is occasion. What's the occasion for writing this document? Why was this document written? A is the audience. So who is the intended audience of this document? P is the purpose. What's this document? What's this article, drawing, whatever we're analyzing? What's it supposed to accomplish? What was the point in writing it, right? The second S is the subject. So that's what the subject of this is. So the subject and the occasion are very similar, but the subject is a more general term. So for example, we know that this particular class is going to be about the Sino-Japanese War. So the subject is most likely going to be the Sino-Japanese War. Lastly, we have tone. Tone is important because tone kind of sets the tone for, like, you know, the speaker. So, oh, whoops. I guess I had all this written down. It's gonna let's just kind of skip through all these. We can kind of review. So tone, what's the attitude of the author in the writing? So sometimes, so that's important because, like, the author could have a sarcastic tone. The author could have an angry tone. The author could have a sad tone. So it really depends on what the author is really trying to convey to determine what the tone of the document is, okay? All right. So for today's, for this soapstone, I actually read a passage from a book written by a Japanese pilot named Saburo Sakai. Okay, so his book is called Samurai, and Saburo Sakai was one of the leading Japanese fighter pilots from World War II. He was from the Japanese Navy, and he saw his first combat action over China. This guy, he later went on to fight the Americans over Guadalcanal, and he flew out of Tainan in the later stages of the war. But early on, when he was still a baby pilot, he flew over China. That was his first combat. So I'm going to read you guys a passage from Samurai. All right. So let's see. I'm going to do a dramatic reading. All right. So in 1938, the Zero fighter plane, which I later came to know so well, was not yet available for combat use. We flew the Mitsubishi Type 96 fighter plane, later given the Allied codename identification of Claude. These were slow and restricted in range. The landing gear was fixed, and we flew with open cockpits, so that means that the wheels of the airplane can't fold up, so the plane flies a little slower. And the open cockpit means that the window of the airplane can't actually close. So if you look at this picture, you can kind of see that the Claude pilot is just kind of chilling in the open, right? Our 15 fighters left Zhejiang early on the morning of the 22nd, adopting a formation of 5 Vs as we climbed. Visibility was excellent. The 90-minute flight from our airbase northwest to Hanzhou was like a leisurely training cruise. No interceptors arose to attack our formation, and not a single anti-aircraft gun disrupted the air with us. It seemed incredible that a war raged down below. From 10,000 feet, the Hanzhou airfield was remarkably deceptive. Bright green grass stood out clearly under the morning sun, and the enemy's major airbase in the area looked for all the world like a sprawling, well-tended golf course. But fighter planes do not use such sporting facilities, and those 3 dots I saw racing over the ground, riding towards our own planes, were enemy fighters. Then suddenly, they were at our altitude, big, black, and powerful. Without waiting, to my astounded mind, at least one of the enemy planes whipped up out of his own formation and bored in with alarming speed at my own fighter. Abruptly, all my careful plans of what I would do in my first combat evaporated. I felt my overtaut muscles twitch nervously, and although it is unpleasant to relate this now, I am certain I trembled with excitement and the shock of the other plane using me for his target. All right, so this is his very first time encountering combat. And Saburo Sakai, this baby Japanese pilot, is just really shook that he's about to see action against the Chinese, against an enemy plane for the very first time. He's really excited at the prospect of, the enemy plane seeing them as a target. I have often believed that I acted stupidly during those crucial moments, and that you as the reader may share this opinion. I must emphasize, however, that our mental reactions at 10,000 feet, after some 90 minutes at this height, without oxygen, were hardly as reliable as we were on the ground. The air is thin, with correspondingly less oxygen reaching the brain. The engine noise in the open cockpit is deafening, as is the streaming cold wind racing past a glass windshield. And there is no such thing as relaxing at the controls. I was turning my head, trying frantically to look in all directions to avoid being caught unawares, working the control stick, the rudder pedals, the throttle, and other controls and instruments. In short, I was completely confused. All right. So that's Saburo Sakai's very first encounter, seeing an enemy plane bearing down upon him. Saburo Sakai actually shot down this airplane, as you can see in this picture. So the airplane was actually a Russian-built Polikarpov I-16. So the Russians supplied some airplanes to the Chinese during World War II. And the Russian I-16 was actually technically a better airplane than the Mitsubishi Claude that Sakai was flying. However, the Chinese pilots were not as well trained as the Japanese pilots. So even though the Japanese pilots were flying slightly inferior airplanes, their training more than made up for it. And the Japanese pilots were able to fly and fight and defeat the Chinese pilots in superior aircraft. So the speaker for that one is Saburo Sakai, right? I'm going to hand that one to you because we know that he wrote this book, right? Now the occasion. So the occasion of this, what's the occasion being described? Anyone have any guesses? Oh, let's go back here. So remember, going back to our soapstone, the occasion, the time, place, and context that prompted this writing. So the occasion for this specific writing is an air battle, right? It's an air battle between China and Japan. Who do you think Saburo Sakai wrote this book for? What's the audience? Who's the audience of this book, Samurai? The public. So Tina says, yeah, the public, both Japanese, Chinese, and American, Japanese readers, Chinese readers, American readers. This book's been translated into lots of different languages for everyone to read. It's a really popular book among aviation history fans. So that's the audience. Yeah, the Japanese, actually, yeah, you're right. The Japanese were the first language that Sakai wrote this book in for obvious reasons. Insight for the war, yeah, that's really good. So the document was written for purpose to give more insight to the air war or to the air war in World War II, because not very many documents and points of view are written by Japanese and Chinese authors. So most of the time, when we have memoirs written by pilots, they are typically made from the Western perspective, because military history, specifically aviation history, is very Western centric. So you don't see a lot of this kind of writing coming out of Japan, coming out of China, coming out of Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam. These are all aviation writing is pretty Western centric. Okay, so what's the subject? What's the subject of the excerpt I just read? I'm going to give you a hint. It's the same subject as this presentation, as this whole class. Which war? Between which two countries?
It's about history, wars, and stuff. About China and Japan.
China and Japan, right. It's about the Second Sino-Japanese War. Thank you, Angela. And the attitude. So what was Saburo Sakai's attitude as he was writing this? What was his tone? Was he excited? Was he scared? Scared. Yeah, I think he was scared. He even admitted himself that he was scared. But he was also excited because it's his first time seeing combat. He's getting to use his training for real for the very first time. So obviously he's going to be a little bit excited. But it's also kind of scary, when you're going to fly and fight in a little airplane, in one of these guys in your open cockpit, a fighter plane. Chances are you're not going to make it back, right? So when you're fighting another airplane, one of you is not going home that day, and you really want it to not be you, right? So it's kind of scary, but it's also kind of exciting. If you're a fighter pilot, that's what you trained for. So very good. So that's your very first soapstone, guys. How was that? I think you guys did pretty good, honestly. So that's a trend that we do, in this class, especially because we're going to be analyzing these documents, these I'm freezing you. We're going to be analyzing these documents and looking at, some of these excerpts, not always from this book, but there'll be other books. We'll just kind of be talking about, what the authors meant, or what they were really trying to say, like what kind of perspectives these documents, these these instances are written from, right? So that's where the critical thinking comes in, because we're going to be thinking, we're going to be using our noggins to think about what these different historical events were like, how to contextualize them, how to fit them all together. All right. So we're going to be combining different perspectives all into one to gain a better understanding of what's going on. So it's kind of like when you're doing algebra or any kind of like math and you're solving for X, you solve for X by using what you do know, and then you fit everything together and you get a better understanding, and then you find X. And that's kind of how we're going to be looking at history too, right? So we're going to be taking different perspectives, analyzing them, and comparing and contrasting them. So that's your very first soapstone, and I think you guys did a really good job. So let's continue. All right, so China does have some elite troops. All right, so even though the Chinese troops are not as well trained or as well equipped as the Japanese troops were, there were some elite troops in China. And these guys were the ones who actually were trained by the German forces. In this picture over here on the left, you see a Chinese machine gun team equipped with a Czech machine gun. So the Czechoslovakia actually sold a lot of machine guns to China before World War II. And that's an example of one of them. It's called the ZB-26. And that's actually one of the weapons that the Japanese feared the most. Okay, so the ZB-26. You can see in this picture that all these Chinese troops are wearing German helmets. So these are the distinctive M35 steel helmets that were worn by German troops in World War II as well. But the Chinese actually got them first. So the Germans, the first batch of M35 helmets ever made in Germany was shipped directly to China. The second batch went to the German Luftwaffe. But the first people to wear them in combat were the Chinese. So that's kind of neat. Little neat bit of trivia for you guys. So these Chinese elite troops, there were 3 divisions of them, all right? And each division had about like 10,000 dudes, give or take. And so there were about 30,000 elite troops in the Chinese army. But 30,000 out of 1,700,000 is not a lot, so not very many of the Chinese troops were this well trained. And these guys saw a lot of action. So there was the 87th, the 88th, and the 36th divisions that were German trained troops, and they were actually like the crown jewel of the Chinese army, so to speak. So you can see this picture of 3 elite troops running during the Battle of Shanghai. So that was one of the biggest battles in the Chinese theater, before World War II fully really kicked off. The Battle of Shanghai was a big deal. It happened in 1937. So, Chinese forces. Let's take a look at our Chinese forces here. Chinese Air Force flew, the main fighter plane flown by the Chinese Air Force was this Curtiss Hawk 3 biplane. Right, so this is an American-made biplane. It's got 2 wings. And it's also got two little 30 caliber machine guns. Okay, not very fast, but pretty nimble. And this was the backbone of the Chinese Air Force at the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War. The average Chinese soldier was not super well equipped. So there's a Chinese soldier with his regular uniform. The Battle of Shanghai was won by the Japanese, but it was a tactical victory for the Chinese. So the Chinese were able to retreat successfully out of Shanghai, and the Japanese were the ones who actually won the battle. The Chinese had to retreat from Shanghai to Nanjing, and then that was when the Battle of Nanjing was fought. So more Chinese troops. So these are more typical troops. You notice how they're not very well equipped at all. Like not all of them even has a gun. Japanese forces, on the other hand, pretty well equipped. Not only does everybody have a gun, they've all got gas masks. They all have protective equipment. The main Japanese fighters were monoplanes. They were more advanced. They were faster. They were just better airplanes on paper and objectively speaking than the Chinese airplanes. The main Chinese fighter was not the I-16 that Saburo Sakai was writing about. The main Chinese fighter was, again, the Curtiss Hawk biplane that I just showed you guys in that picture. So the Japanese, not only they had better pilots and better airplanes, they had better training, they had better weapons, they had better troop equipment. They even had ships. The Chinese Navy was pretty much non-existent, whereas the Japanese had like battleships, and they could sail up to rivers and like help support troops on the ground, giving pretty valuable artillery fire during the Battle of Shanghai. No, those aren't AKs. Those weapons in that picture are Japanese Type 38 rifles. And that's a Japanese machine gun on the bottom. The primary Chinese infantry rifle, let's see, is it easy to grab for me right now? No, it's kind of behind some stuff. I'm not gonna go get it. The primary, what the heck? I'll show you guys. So, 1 second. So the Chinese military was primarily equipped with two types of weapons. Okay, so the primary weapon was actually this guy right here. So this is called a Hanyang Type 88. And this gun was, this rifle was actually from the Qing dynasty. So this is the last rifle adopted by the Imperial Qing dynasty in the year 1888. Okay, so by the time that this war rolled around in like 1937, the Hanyang had been around for almost 50 years. Okay, so it was this is old. This is old technology, but it's still the most numerous weapon in Chinese stores. So the Japanese were rolling around with the Arisaka Type 38, Type 99. So like they had more advanced weaponry than the Chinese. Okay, so this is a really old Chinese rifle. Okay, so by the time World War II started, this gun was already 50 years old. Yeah, sorry. I'm just kind of showing you guys an example of how old the Chinese equipment was. I don't mean to be scary, Vincent. So it's an older weapon, okay? So the Chinese were not very well equipped. The Chinese did not have very good weapons. The Chinese were equipped with like 50-year-old guns by the at the start of this war. Yeah, that one's real, but it's not gonna shoot anytime soon. It's too old. I wouldn't trust it to actually function. So it's more like a collector's piece, if that makes sense. It's more like for display. But yeah, it really is that old, and if it's from 1888, it's like more than 100 years old. So that's kind of cool, Now, also the Japanese had tanks. All right, so the Japanese had like actual tanks. The Chinese weren't. They had some tanks. The Chinese had some tanks, but not as much as the Japanese. So the Chinese were kind of at the mercy of Japanese armor in a lot of battles, which is kind of sad, when you think about it, because they didn't really have like real weaponry or anything like that. Whereas the Japanese forces had armored cars, tanks, artillery, battleships. It was kind of crazy, how much fire superiority the Japanese military had over the Chinese military. So this was kind of tough. This was not going to be an easy fight, and the Chinese knew that. Let's see, your hand is up, Wesley. You want to say something? Okay. Remember, if you want to ask a question, you can ask it in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Either works. I'm gonna go look through the gallery real quick. We're doing pretty okay. All right. So the Battle of Shanghai actually happened between August 13th, 1937, and November 26th, 1937. So the Battle of Shanghai was a really, really long battle. And what it eventually boiled down to, I'll talk about that. So the Japanese forces had effective support from aircraft, warships, and artillery. So the Japanese actually had a decent amount of fires priority over the Chinese in this battle. Exactly, yeah, 3 to 4 months. It wasn't years. It was like from August to November. So like almost 4 months long. It was a really long battle. Now, the Japanese forces had effective support from their more advanced fire support, whereas the Chinese were kind of stuck with infantry, like small arms and mainly infantry units. So whereas the Japanese had things like airplanes, tanks, they had artillery, they had the Navy ships, off the river, able to like use their main cannons to support their infantry. The Chinese are mostly stuck with rifles, small rifles, small arms. Their troops had to individually support themselves, and they didn't have things like airplanes or tanks to support them. So that was kind of that was really tough. Oh, that's cool. I like your katana. Vincent. So, the Chinese had some armor units. The Chinese had some Panzer ones. So those are so like really old, early examples of tanks that were sold to China from Germany. So here's a example of a Panzer one. All right, so the Chinese had some of these, but they weren't very effective in urban combat. So in urban combat, when you're fighting along like streets and alleyways, tanks aren't very useful because all you got to do is block the alley and the tank can't really go through. A Panzer one like this is not a big tank. This tank cannot run over buildings. It could probably run over a tree, but not a big tree, and like it couldn't bust through buildings. It couldn't bust through walls. Okay, so these older, smaller tanks aren't what we think tanks are now. So because of that, they're not very useful in urban combat. So both Japanese and Chinese tanks were quickly stopped by infantry units in urban combat. Because if you're rolling in a tank up like a narrow alleyway, all a soldier has to do is sneak behind you, climb on top of the tank, and throw a grenade in it, and that's basically what happened. So the Chinese were doing their best though, and if we the Sihang warehouse was this warehouse in Shanghai across from the international concession. So that's like where all the European people, the French, the British, the Germans had their like embassies, essentially. And the Sihang warehouse, yeah, you've seen the movie 800 Heroes. Yeah, so that was kind of like the final stand of the 88th Division. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit too. Let's see what this is. So here's some Chinese soldiers. No, actually, I take that back. Those are Japanese soldiers standing in front of an old Coca-Cola ad. Pretty funny. It says Coca-Cola. And here we got some Japanese soldiers advancing through rubble. Okay. So Air Force Day, on the second day of the Battle of Shanghai, okay, the Chinese Air Force was actually able to successfully intercept a flight of Japanese bombers. So flying those same antiquated Curtiss Hawk biplanes, there was a pilot named Gao Zhihang that was able to shoot down, that led his flight to shoot down these bombers. So that's him. That's our boy Gao Zhihang right there. So 18 Japanese bombers took off to attack Jianqiao Air Base in China. 18 bombers. Let's see. So Gao Zhihang led the 4th fighter group to intercept the enemy aircraft. So if you look on the side of his Curtiss Hawk, you see the Roman numeral 4-1. Okay, so 4 stands for the 4th fighter group, and he's pilot number 1. So he's the leader of the 4th fighter group. So that's how you read that tactical number on the side of that airplane. So Gao Zhihang led the 4th fighter group to intercept the enemy aircraft. And the Chinese pilots were actually able to shoot down 6 Japanese bombers to no losses of their own. And that's when the Japanese realized that the Chinese Air Force were capable of fighting back. Okay, so up until that point, the Chinese Air Force was basically non-existent. The Japanese were able to do what they wanted. But the Chinese Air Force wanted to prove that if they wanted to fight, they could fight. And so Gao Zhihang was able to do this and lead his squadron and shoot down some 6 Japanese airplanes. And this day was still, to this day, is still considered to be Air Force Day, at least in Taiwan and China. So that's what this story is. So, siege of Sihang warehouse. Wesley and Phoebe, are you guys confused? I see some question marks from you, Wesley. What's up, bud?
I just don't know what they're talking about in the chat.
Oh, okay. The movie they're talking about the 800 Heroes movie, the 800. Yeah, it's a movie about the Chinese 88th Division. So the 88th, the 1st Battalion of the 524th Regiment of the 88th Division. So this was one of the elite German trained divisions. They had about 800 soldiers. Okay. And they were holding up in the Sihang warehouse. They were facing off against a 3rd Division of the Imperial Japanese Army, which had about 20,000 men. So it was kind of 800 against 20,000. And the Sihang warehouse, like I said earlier, was located just across the Suzhou River from the foreign concessions in Shanghai. So this was a specific spot that they chose. Chiang Kai-shek specifically wanted the 88th Division to hole up in this warehouse so they would be an open view of all the foreigners that were watching the battle unfold. It was important that the Japanese, or that everyone kind of saw that the Chinese were actually holding off against the Japanese forces here, because Chiang Kai-shek wanted all the foreign powers to know that China wasn't just going to surrender. Okay. So remember how I was talking about how most of the Chinese soldiers were equipped with these? So these old Hanyang 88s, right? These 50, 60-year-old guns. And that's not that's not saying much either, because most of the Chinese soldiers probably didn't even have guns, but those who did had to be issued these older hand-me-downs. Now the 88th Division was a little luckier. The 88th Division got a new rifle called a Type 24. So these were modeled after a German rifle called the Mauser 98. And this is the Germans, when the German troops entered World War II, they were equipped with a very similar rifle called the Kar 98. And it was a lot more modern. Still a bolt action rifle, but it was a lot more modern, a little bit shorter, a little bit handier, I guess. And this is what the elite troops of the 88th Division carried. Okay. So they had slightly better guns, slightly better equipment than the rest of the Chinese army. And that's important, because the Chinese leaders knew that if they wanted to hole up a division of troops in the Sihang warehouse, they needed to pick a well-equipped division. They needed to pick good soldiers who were able to fight with, and they had to pick soldiers that had good equipment, right? Because if they just sent one of the regular divisions of troops to hole up in the Sihang warehouse, that, a regular division of troops that wasn't as well equipped, like, what's going to happen? They're all just going to die, and there's not going to be any real show or any real defense, for them to put up. So it was really important for the Chinese that they send a division of troops that would actually be able to fight against the Japanese and hold off for long enough to gain foreign support. Because what China needed at the time was China needed the rest of the world to turn against Japan and feel like Japan was the bad guys. And so that's why they essentially sacrificed the 88th Division, leaving them at the Sihang warehouse to do this. So in case you guys were thinking, why would you waste your best trained troops in a warehouse and just leave them all to die? That's why. Because they were willing to make that sacrifice for the 88th Division to stay in the Sihang warehouse to cover the retreat of the rest of the Chinese military as they retreated westward out of Shanghai, because they needed to buy them time. Okay. That being said, only 10 Chinese troops were killed with 37 wounded. The IJA reported over 200 troops killed. And right now you can actually go visit the Sihang warehouse that's been converted into a museum. So you can still kind of see it. And that's what it looks like on the inside. They've got these mannequins that are set up like the 88th Division troops with their Chiang Kai-shek rifles and ZB-26s. So pretty neat. Have any of you guys ever been to Shanghai? You've been to, you can still visit the Sihang warehouse in Shanghai. I'm sure it's like a tourist attraction now, especially after the movie came out. So a lot more people are probably interested in visiting that warehouse. You saw the skyline? Nice. Yeah, it's cool. So in 1941, you can kind of see where the Japanese occupation is too. So Shanghai has been, let me fix this real quick. Just want to make sure that I can, okay, here you go, sorry. Make sure you guys can see my mouse. So Shanghai has been safely occupied, right? So the Chinese have lost Shanghai. They're moving southeastwards. The Japanese have taken Nanjing as well. So these red pockets here, that's where the Chinese communists are kind of held up. And the nationalist Chinese are over here, green spot. So Japan needs to expand outwards here into these islands to get the natural resources, all the natural resources that the Chinese, so when Japan was invading China, what they really wanted was to get the Chinese natural resources, right? And those natural resources are all kind of right over here. So especially like in southwestern China, in Tibet even, like that's where a lot of natural resources in China are. And the Japanese were actually not successful in getting to it. So remember how in the very beginning we were talking about like what's important in a war, like what do you need to win to win a war? And one of those things was natural resources, right? Now Japan doesn't have those resources. Japan's a little country, like a little bit of island groups right over here. They're importing a lot of oil. They're importing a lot of oil from the United States. They're hoping to invade China and win China to get the natural resources from China. All right. And as a matter of fact, the Japanese conquest of China was not even supposed to be a full-blown war. Japan was expecting the China to surrender. And why do you guys think China? Well, so the reason why, or actually, yeah, I can ask you guys this. Do you guys think that Japan had a good reason to believe that China would surrender? Like, do you guys think China should have surrendered? What? Yeah, what do you think, Vincent? I'm going to call on you. Whoops. So like, because there is a specific, let's see. It is Wesley? That's raising his hand? Yeah, Wesley.
I just want to say that China should not be defeated because that's really my favorite place in the world.
Okay, very good, Wesley. I'm gonna be real with you though, Wesley. So up until this point, anytime China was invaded by an outside power, be it the Dutch, be it the British, be it the Americans even, China always kind of keeled over and gave up, right? So at this point, when faced with a greater imperial power, the Chinese historically to this point did surrender. Okay, now this was different though. So Japan was like, okay, so China's used to surrendering. China was probably gonna, like, they surrendered against the the China surrendered against the British, China surrendered against the Dutch, China surrendered against the Germans even. So why shouldn't they surrender to us, right? That's when the Japanese miscalculated, because the Japanese expected the Chinese to surrender so they could just take all of their natural resources. But China didn't surrender. And now Japan is locked in this war with a country that they can't really beat because it's too big. So Japan now needed to expand southward to take over what they wanted to. Whoops. All right. So that's kind of an issue here. Now, when they couldn't get their natural resources in China by 1941, so this is kind of like what the situation in China looked like. Japan realized, okay, we need to get natural resources elsewhere. And because of the war with China, the United States stopped giving the Japanese oil in 1941. So Japan only had about 6 months of oil left at that point in the war, and they needed to expand elsewhere to get oil. So their idea was that they would start going southward into the Pacific Ocean, taking the Dutch East Indies. So these are all pretty oil-rich areas here, Indochina as well. And so these are all territories that the Japanese were hoping to expand outwards from and seize. But these specific territories here were challenged. The Japanese had to make sure that one country was not going to get involved. One country that had a presence in the Pacific was not going to, fight them over, right? What country what country do you think the Japanese were afraid of? I'm gonna wait for someone to say it in the chat. Who do you think the Japanese were afraid of? What were the Japanese planning for? Tina says the British. Tina's kind of close. British were one of the countries. Langston says America. Sophie says Germany. Langston, you're actually correct. The Japanese were afraid of the Americans. Okay. So the Japanese needed the Americans to not fight in this war. The Japanese, because they already miscalculated against the Chinese, the Japanese already were like, oh, we thought the Chinese would surrender. We need to make sure that the Americans don't actually surrender, because if we miscalculate twice, there's no way that we can win. Okay, the Chinese are already committed to fighting us in China. If they're gonna try to seize these islands over here and Indochina over here, the Japanese really need to make sure that they're not miscalculating this time. So they come up with a really smart plan to check to see how the Americans would respond to attack. They needed to make sure that America didn't want to fight, so that if they delivered a crushing blow to the United States, that the Americans, unlike the Chinese, would actually surrender. But Japan was not going to miscalculate this time. Japan was going to make sure that their attack was going to be successful and that the Americans would give up. So they came up with a really, really smart idea. And that's this right here. The USS Panay Incident. So the USS Panay, this is an American gunboat, okay? December 12th, 1937. So the USS Panay is an American ship in China. What do you guys think the Japanese are going to do to it? I'm going to call on Tina. Tina, what do you think the Japanese are going to do to the USS Panay? Tina says sink it. Who else? And also, Wesley gives us the thumbs up party emoji. Thank you, Wesley. Yeah. Vincent, what do you think? You can unmute yourself if you want to talk. Burn it. Aim at the bottom. Okay, you guys are really, really good at this. So the Japanese are. You're right. All of you guys are correct. They are going to try to destroy this ship. Right? They're going to try to destroy this boat. So the Panay Incident. Panay was an American gunboat on the Yangtze River. Okay. 12 carrier-based airplanes, including fighters and dive bombers, were used to attack the American gunboat. So they even used the same type of aircraft, that they were going to use to do this other big operation on this gunboat, right? So they bombed it with airplanes, okay? And then they were just like, they told the Americans, hey, this was an accident. Everyone knew that this wasn't an accident. The Japanese knew it wasn't an accident. The American sailors on the ship knew. It's like, hey, come on, you guys totally bombed us on purpose, right? But the Japanese wanted to see how the Americans would respond. So the Japanese were like, okay, guys, this was an accident. Just to see how the Americans would respond. And America responded by accepting that explanation. All right. And all Japan had to do was pay about $2 million to the United States as a reparation for the bombing of this ship. All right. people died on the USS Panay. Americans died on the ship when the Japanese bombed it, and all Japan had to do was pay money and tell them that it was an accident. So this told the Japanese that they could get away with something like this. Yeah, they straight up was like, this told the Japanese like, hey, like the United States, they don't really want to fight us, so maybe there's more that we can get away with. And this was how they figured, you know, maybe we can actually get the Americans out of the war by attacking them with one fell swoop. And if that sounds like something else that you guys may have heard of that started the American entry into World War II, you'd be right. Okay, so that's exactly right. The USS Panay, in a sense, was the Japanese test to see how the Americans would respond to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Exactly, Langston. You're exactly right. The Panay showed the Japanese that the Americans were not willing to fight, that the Americans would accept explanations, that the Americans were trying to avoid war. So they were like, okay, we may have miscalculated the Chinese, but we know for sure that we didn't miscalculate the Americans. Okay, now we know now that they were wrong because we hella beat them during World War II. But the Japanese at that time, you know, were like, okay, like we now have an idea that the Americans are going to surrender and the Americans are not going to want to fight us. And that was really a huge thing for the Japanese because they were like, okay, like we miscalculated in China. The Chinese are fighting us in a war that we don't really want to be fighting them with. But at least when we start to expand towards the Pacific, we can count on the Americans not being involved. And boy, were they wrong. All right. Let's see. All right. So typically, and you know, during this part of the class, I'd be asking you guys if we had any like, I'd be kind of assigning some reading assignments. So like I said earlier, this is a trial class, a test class, if you guys will. So if you guys can like see how a typical class would kind of go. I would be assigning some homework. I'd be assigning some reading at this point, but you know, since this is a trial class, I don't have any reading or anything prepared for you guys. I'm going to go over some things, some materials that we could be. Yeah, I'm sorry. I have to. There's actually going to be like a midterm and a final too, like I said earlier. But not for this class. I'm not going to do it like for this lesson because this is just a trial lesson. Let me go ahead and share with you guys something that is kind of important. Here. Share screen. There we go. All right. So this is our program, right? So there is, I will assign some books and articles and readings for everybody, you know, during our regular class. And we'll like touch base on that and talk about like what we read about and stuff like that in the beginning of each class. So there's generally a class discussion in the beginning, which we kind of just share our thoughts on like any matter. You guys seem to be pretty comfortable using the chat function, which is really cool. I've had classes that are more comfortable like actually talking. So it depends on like the kids really. If you guys are more comfortable sharing in the chat than you are like unmuting yourselves and talking, that's fine. However, public speaking is one of the major focuses of the Able to Shine program, and it's important to me that we are comfortable talking to each other about things that we learned. So at the beginning of every session, I will be having everybody take turns, and we will all 10, 12 of you guys, depending on how many people are in each class, are going to have to share for about 2 or 3 minutes at a time about the reading and also about something that we did during the homework and the previous lesson. All right, so that's going to be a little bit of your like public speaking presentation. There will be a midterm and final quizzes for, you know, key content with the actual like quiz, I guess. So that's also kind of important to me. So that's something that I want you guys to keep in mind, okay? Let's see. So this is kind of what an average structure would be like. So we'll have a warm-up discussion. The recap is going to be done not just by me, but by you guys. You'll be sharing about what we learned and also about what you read about. We'll be doing a primary source analysis. So in this case, it will be like our Saburo Sakai reading, or we soapstone some documents and talk about like, different angles in different contexts, like, or different things within the context of history. And then after that's our main presentation, and then the reading assignment and also the post discussion and reflection comes a little bit after that. But so that's kind of how this works. So it's gonna be in a similar structure to this. Do you have any questions? Emmy, do you want to say? Okay. But yeah, so yeah, so here I'll show you guys some examples of themes. So we have some different themes planned out. We have some different themes planned out. So 101 is going to be the Great American Inventors. All right. They're not exactly set in stone yet. I believe that's going to be for Ping and Lena to figure out. They should typically be on Saturdays. And also there may be classes during the week, depending on how enrollment goes. Here are some of the examples, the Great American Inventors. We'll be talking about Ben Franklin, Thomas Edison, Washington Carver, Elon Musk, how America is a technological innovation, how there's a lot of that in like how that has really influenced the United States and the very fiber of our being. 102, wars and weaponry. If you kind of enjoy like military history, for example, that's kind of my specific focus. I'll be sharing about how weapons have evolved over time, like not just my Hanyang and Chiang Kai-shek, but I've got some other weapons, some slightly more modern weapons here. This is a Delta Force operators Colt 723 carbine that they use in their early 90s, right? So we got some weapons like that. That's the kind of stuff that you guys are interested in. That's the class that you want to take. Wars and weaponry. And that goes from the Revolutionary War up to the Global War on Terror. So that's a pretty cool class. I think a lot of you guys are going to be interested in that one. I'm excited for that one. 103, the Great American Entrepreneurs. From Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, Henry Ford, all these great entrepreneurs that really like define. Can you send it? Yeah. I'll have Ping and Lena forward this to everybody. I think they plan to do this anyway. And then 104, Chinese American history. So Chinese American history talks about kind of like how the Chinese American experience has kind of like passed over and like how that's affected us, how Chinese American identity has kind of has evolved over time, including the transcontinental railroad building, the Chinese Exclusion Act, just pretty neat. 105 is Birth of a Nation, talking about the very fibers and foundation of America. And lastly, 106, which is Shining City on a Hill, talking about how America has evolved into a global superpower that it is today. So these are all like some of the examples of classes that we'll be offering. And so it's from 7 to 14 years classes. Like I will basically be adjusting the depth of what we're covering depending on the age group of the kids that we have involved. So like, for example, with the younger kids, we'll probably get like not as super in depth, and the reading is going to be a little bit easier for you, for like some of the younger kids. For the older kids, I'll be assigning more detailed reading, so to speak. So it'll be kind of like, it'll be age appropriate, basically. That's what I'm trying to say. And there's me. I'm not wearing glasses like I am in that picture, but yeah. So yeah, if you guys have any other questions, feel free to stick around. I think we can be ending this one